Aloha, everybody. I am thrilled to be here today in Hawaii talking to a person whose story has fascinated me ever since I first heard about it, which was many years ago. Tricia Allen is a central figure in the revival of Polynesian tattoo culture and the mentoring of island tattooers, bridging the gap to their own heritage. And her first book on tattoo traditions of Hawaii was a Bible to any of us that were interested in Polynesian tribal tattooing, as its pioneers began to show up on all of our convention stages worldwide. So I'd very much like to welcome Tricia Allen. I'm excited to hear her story. Good morning.
Good morning, and thank you for that great introduction.
We'll just kick it off with one question, and that really would be, how did you come to be interested in the history of Polynesian tattooing?
40 years ago, I would have thought it never would be. A Polynesian tattoo or tattooing in general was the last thing that would ever even enter my mind. But I was really intrigued with Pacific art, as well as Native American and African. I had taken a class when I was doing an undergrad degree in what they called primitive art back then. And it was a story of a gable mask, the big woven mask that's on the peak of the men's houses, the meeting houses in Papua New Guinea. And the other iconography or images that's on the facade or the front of these houses. The story goes, there was a cannibal giant who was terrorizing everybody. He was eating all of the villagers, and everyone tried to stop the cannibal giant, and nobody could. So a postmenopausal woman copulated with a banana and bore two sons, two twin boys. And the boys grew quickly and were successful in killing the cannibal giant. So the gable mask at the top of the meeting house is the cannibal giant. Then all of the other images as we're coming down towards the doorway are also related to that story. And then just above the door, there's a woman with splayed legs. Down one side, she has sometimes a river or water. Sometimes it's a snake. But that symbolizes her water breaking and the birth of the Sepik River, which is of great importance to parts of Papua New Guinea and is reflected in their art and so on. I liked this legend. I thought, that's fun. If all of these art pieces have stories like this, I could get into this. I liked that better than I liked the story of Immaculate Conception and the Virgin Mary. So I thought, okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more. After I finished that course, I was doing a degree in art history and realized that I could get an internship at the Denver Art Museum, which is a major art museum and has a huge native art collection. The curator that I worked under, Richard Kahn, his area was Native American. So by default, Oceanic and African art fell to me, which was great. I got to handle all of these beautiful pieces and clean out the cases and dust the shelves in the storerooms and so on. So while I was there, every day I'd walk by a display case, a small case, and it showed an image of a tattooed Marquesan who is tattooed head to toe. And I used to think, why in the world would anybody do that? That was the extent of it. I really never had any other interest. And before I moved here to Hawaii, I was talking to a friend who was a fellow juggler. We were both jugglers. And he said at a gathering, hey, while you're in Hawaii, see what you can find on their tattoo history and tattoo traditions. And I thought, yeah, right. Thinking there wouldn't be anything. I wouldn't have any interest. Why would I even encounter that? And I let it go. I wish that I was still in contact with him. His name was Mace, but we lost contact 35 years ago. So when I moved here to Oahu, I was initially in the art history department, but they didn't have a grad program or a grad degree in Pacific art. It was the art of Asia and the Pacific. I would have had to study things like the history of Chinese calligraphy, which I had no interest in. I knew what I wanted to focus on, and I knew it was Pacific or oceanic art. So I saw a flyer on campus that was advertising a course called Pacific Prehistory, and made note of the instructor's name and tracked him down one day and went and knocked on his office door and said, this is my story and these are my transcripts and I'm interested. Do you want me over here? And he said, sure. So I wound up in archaeology, and I wasn't going to sort dirt and dig holes all day and deal with skeletal remains when you're used to big, beautiful pieces of art. To go to little bits of broken pottery and bones, no. So I researched skull cults or skull preservation in the Sepik area of Papua New Guinea and Marquesan tattoo for 2 years just to see what was out there because I had to choose a topic for my master's thesis. While I was looking at Marquesan tattoo, I noticed a major stylistic change that happened. It went from very fine, detailed lines to big, bold, black areas that were totally darkened in. And nobody had really published on this or noticed this before. So I thought, okay, there's my master's thesis. Let's focus on the accuracy of these illustrations and how might that change have come about. So I really delved into the early original accounts and illustrations, particularly Willadine Handy's work. She wound up being the focus of my master's thesis. Her work, Tattooing in the Marquesas, which was 1920. She and her husband, who was an archaeologist, and a couple of other archaeologists were on an expedition sponsored by the Bishop Museum to the Marquesas. So she wound up encountering about 125 tattooed elders at that time and photographed and drew them and tried to do a geographic analysis of the tattoo motifs, which did not work. But another funny sideline while she was there, the tattoos are kind of hard to make out because these were on elderly people and they're fairly dark-skinned people that have spent their life in the sun. And tattoos fade, of course. So, the marks were pretty subtle. She painted over them, painting the contrast. She could get better photographs showing it designs. And when I discovered that in her notes, I thought, boy, what did these poor people think of her? What, you want to paint over my tattoos? Well, go ahead, I guess, but it's just such an odd thing. But it was pretty effective. She did get good photographs. So I worked on her work and the problems, methodological and theoretical problems in her work and the accuracy of the illustrations of Marquesan tattoo for my master's thesis.
And so what was with the dark black? I know you said that had changed. Did you ever find out why that had changed?
Yeah, it took me quite a while. And at first, and what I could include in my master's thesis was exposure to other islanders, Rapa Nui in particular. On Rapa Nui, they have these paddles, dance paddles, that are painted with these heavy black stripes across the faces of the image that's on the end of the paddle. We know that islanders were traveling. Now we know from the DNA that there were Marquesans on Rapa Nui, and Rapa Nui people probably made it to the Marquesas. Even if the people didn't make it there, chances are pretty good that one of these paddles might have. And just like us today, we're inspired by what we see, by new designs. So it wouldn't have surprised me if the Marquesan people copied this in their tattooing as a result of exposure to other island artifacts and other island people. So that was one possibility. And about 12 years later, I was down in Tahiti with a dear friend, Robert Koenig, who was at that time the president of the Society for the Preservation of Oceanic Culture. And they have a big library and an archive there. So I was talking to Robert about this. About what the punishment would have been for tattooing after the ban. Now, I knew that the missionary seat was in the northern Marquesas on Nukuhiva, and the waters there are very rough. There's no offshore reefs like we have here in Hawaii. It's really rough water that's going straight up to cliffs. So it's hard to get from one island to the other, but it's certainly doable. People today do it all the time. So the missionaries are there on Nukuhiva, and by 1860, enforcing this ban on tattooing. So what are you going to do if you're a tattooist, or if you want a tattoo? You're going to go to the Southern Islands, right, to practice. And there in Tahiti, I did get verification at the archives that the penalty for tattooing after the first offense or getting tattooed was to build 10 fathoms of road. Second offense, 20 fathoms. Third offense, 30 fathoms. The Cook Islands had similar punishments, but they also imposed a fine in the Cook Islands. So the fifth offense of getting tattooed or doing a tattoo after the ban was to entirely blacken in the designs. This heavy black style was not an indigenous style whatsoever. It was basically censor bars. Now, what's curious is the penalty for tattooing was more tattooing. And if you think about it, who was doing this tattooing, blackening in the designs? Did they force the tattooist to do it? Probably. Or did these missionaries do it and blacken in this? Yeah, so it's interesting because today people are reviving this and they're doing a lot of those heavy black stripes across the face, whereas the earlier indigenous style was very fine lined and very detailed.
Now, there was somewhere in Hawaii, as I understand it, Maui, where they did large black scale tattooing at a certain point, correct?
Yeah, that's true. Kahikili and the descendants of the thunder god Kanehikili would tattoo half their body entirely black. So there is definitely a tradition there. Now, Hawaii was kind of different than elsewhere in the Pacific because basically it was a feudal system here. There were different chiefdoms, and they each had slightly different practices and approaches to everything, to cooking, to fishing, to hula, maybe to chant. There's different dialects of the Hawaiian language on different islands. So nothing was universal. And it seems that designs were, at least by the time of European contact, by the time that there's European explorers recording them, which of course is our first knowledge of the designs, they seem to have been pretty standardized. We only find 5 different motifs when we're looking at those early drawings. And some of these explorers and these artists were going ashore in different places. It's not like they only landed once and then sailed off to the south. So it does appear that by that time, it was pretty limited and somewhat standardized. But by 1819, which is the year that Kamehameha died, there was a Frenchman who was not formally trained in art. He was a juggler and a magician. So Hawaiians loved him. His name was Jacques Arago. He was the artist on board the Freycinet voyage. And he did sketches for people, like caricatures, and gave them to people. He did magic tricks. Kalani Moku, meeting him for the first time, pulled a deck of cards out of his malo, or his loincloth, and demanded to see card tricks. So Arago had quite a reputation. He wasn't a stuffy Brit. And if you think about it, on these voyages, who had license to roam and go? There's a Hawaiian word, holo holo, which just means go travel and go see what you see. The first mate and the captain and the officers certainly couldn't. They had to stay and keep an eye on the ship, right? So the only people that could really go do that were the artist and the naturalist. Jacques Arago spent all of his time on shore. He did not go back to the ship at night. He constantly complained about Hawaiian food. He was totally intrigued with women's breasts, tattooing, and skull crushing. He wrote a number of journals and different editions of his trip here. Was quite the active artist and drew a number of Native Hawaiian people, many of whom were fairly heavily tattooed. So it's Arago's drawings that perhaps provide our best look at Hawaiian tattooing, but this is 50 years after contact, 1819. Hawaii was in a state of turmoil because Kamehameha had just died. And two, as you probably know, Kamehameha had unified the islands. So maybe that's why by, 1816, the voyage before Arago and Freycinet, those drawings and the drawings by Arago show a pretty limited range of design motifs. Now, the other thing that we find in those drawings, which is somewhat amusing, is a lot of introduced motifs. There's a drawing of a Hawaiian gentleman wearing a Mohawk-style haircut. He's tattooed with a fan, a Hawaiian fan, on the side of his head. He's talking to a woman who's casually nursing a baby. This gentleman is wearing a cutaway tailcoat with a malo or a loincloth. He has a large musket tattooed on the side of his leg. So Hawaiians were immediately adopting European imagery, even at first contact. First contact with his third Cook voyage, a Hawaiian came on board the ship and was fascinated with a compass, went back in his canoe to shore, and came back to the ship the next day with it tattooed on his body.
Well, quite fascinating, but no eagles on the chest yet, at any rate.
No, not yet. But this is the only place that happened so quickly that we have the incorporation of introduced designs almost immediately at contact. If tattooing were strictly culturally prescribed, like in Samoa, where it's men wear this with very little variation, women wear this, or the Marquesas, where it was very similar, we didn't find the introduction of Western motifs and new designs, but in Hawaii we did. So that kind of indicates that there was a lot of liberty here, that Hawaiians could get or give any tattoo that they wanted. But again, there was a lot of variation because Hawaii before Kamehameha was like a feudal system.
Well, there's also a lot more contact here, though.
There was a lot of contact here in Lahaina. There were a lot of whalers. There was the sandalwood trade, and alcohol and gambling got so out of hand in Lahaina that the Native Hawaiians banned it. And we're kind of happy to have the missionaries come in and be there because it really was getting out of hand with all of the partying and the drinking and the gambling that occurred in Lahaina. Now, while we're on the topic of gambling, let's jump to the Marquesas because there's a funny story there. They were gambling after European contact in the Marquesas, and the standard currency there, instead of poker chips, they used matches. And matches, of course, had a tremendous amount of value. You can instantly strike a fire. So matches were really highly desired, but matches were the common item that was used in gambling. So rather than ban gambling, the French banned matches. And while I was on Nukuhiva, in a small village, population of about 180 on the northern coast called Hatiheu, you could not buy matches or a lighter in the little store there. Little store was the size of most people's kitchen. It was quite small, but you could get most emergency supplies. You could buy a candle, but you couldn't buy a match. So it's interesting. I often wonder about things like this and how much of this is a holdover from ancient times, from when they banned matches.
Yeah, that's curious. And so in the Marquesas and the other islands, the tattooing was the designs would have only been found in the archives that you were actually able to get your hands on in museums all over the world, where you could access the drawings from these ships, from the voyages that had been done. And it was kind of not so connected to the outside world that it had really changed that much over time, I'm assuming.
Right, that's very true. By Willowdene Handy's visit, 1920, there were 125 tattooed individuals, and they were all elderly. So yeah, tattooing had died out completely. It wasn't until the 1980s that tattooing went through a resurgence. There were a lot of drawings and a lot of records on Marquesan tattoo, probably in the neighborhood of 300 early drawings and illustrations. So some of those made it into the hands of practitioners and people, I'll say today, but really in the 1980s. And when they started the revival in the Marquesas, or in Tahiti first, they were reviving Marquesan designs, whereas in early times, Tahitian tattoo and Marquesan tattoo were extremely different. Most people today would not even recognize or be able to identify a drawing of an old Tahitian tattoo.
So when did you first encounter tattooing in the islands yourself?
I didn't encounter it until I traveled there in 91, but I was aware of it. I had been corresponding with 5 people on Rapa Nui, and I knew that there was no one practicing tattoo there other than kids kind of hand poking and using sewing needles like they do here. But there were people that had a genuine interest in the history of tattoo and in tattoo research. So we started corresponding in the late 80s, maybe 89, 1990. And this is well before email. So it was snail mail that we were sending back and forth. And in the late there was a publication called Tahiti Tattoos. From that, I knew that there was a revival going on in Tahiti and that it was largely Marquesan designs that were being utilized, which I was curious about. And a number of the images in that book were also paint-ons. They weren't real tattoos. But from the book, I knew of people like Ro'onui and Shime and Perutu and Raymond Graff. And these are the individuals that were responsible for the revival there. A gentleman named Tavana Salman, who had lived here in Hawaii and had a Tahitian dance review here, when he left Hawaii, he went to some of the German museums with one of his young dancers, Teve, who is Marquesan, and looked at some of these drawings. And he went to Tahiti, where he settled down. And in 1982, he sponsored 2 Samoan tattooists to go to Tahiti to demonstrate traditional tattooing in Heva, their Bastille Day festival. So it was there in 1982, and he hosted them again in 83, that some of the Tahitians had the opportunity to first see traditional tattooing. They weren't really allowed to interact with the Samoans, but they would have had a language barrier also. But these Tahitians, Purutu, Shime, Ro'onui, and Raymond Graff had the opportunity to watch it and were pretty determined to give it a try on their own. That's when the revival really got kickstarted in Tahiti. And pretty quickly, they switched over to, I'll say modern machines, but they were homemade machines using slot car engines and CD motors, and most commonly using electric razors. There was a company that sold electric shavers, and they made posters that you'd see in the pharmacies or drugstores with a photo of one of their shavers, and it said for tattooing. So even the manufacturer of this shaver was well aware that people were using these as tattoo machines. So when I first arrived there in 91, that's predominantly what people were using. There was almost no exposure to modern professional machines. And many of them were doing outstanding work, considering that they were using sewing needles. They couldn't get equipment like gloves and professional needles, but they were doing some impressive work with homemade equipment. So I was fairly determined to try and help them get better supplies. I came back and was making tattoo machines out of everything and building rheostats. I discovered that you can pretty easily build a rheostat if you can solder from the knob on an electric stove. So I built about 25 rheostats, which were basically a copy of the battery panel that Spalding Rogers sold that I was using. I had learned and was told by Ed Hardy, who was to some degree my mentor or advisor, that DC power was much more regular. It's a steady power. It doesn't have the fluctuations that AC does. So I worked off a motorcycle battery or a fire alarm battery for the first 25 years I was tattooing, and just used this battery panel as a rheostat. I discovered that the colored wire insulation inside a phone was the perfect size for making a needle grouping of 3. So I took down boxes of 1,000 needles and lots of phone wire and showed them how to make at least a 3 needle grouping, because they hadn't even heard of or thought of multiple needles for their machines. And none of these guys at this point were doing traditional tattooing. It's not like I discouraged them in any way. I didn't meet anyone who was actively using traditional tools. I knew that they had experimented with it, but I'd experimented with it also. They certainly weren't using it on a regular basis.
Backing up a little bit, let's talk about your meeting. Like, how did you meet Ed Hardy?
While I was a graduate student in the anthropology department, and studying all of these illustrations, and my thoughts were, as long as I have to go through every book in the library in the Pacific collection and look at the illustrations, I might as well document it all. So I had quite an archive of Pacific tattoo images and references. And I'd been at it for probably about 3 years at that point, and was giving a presentation at the university, and there were flyers all over campus saying Hawaiian tattoo presentation. I think that the department might have even sent notices to the university paper and newspapers. I don't know. So we had a good turnout, a couple of hundred people. It was in a decent sized lecture hall. For the most part, I was covering the early form and showing all of these original drawings of early Hawaiian tattoos and talking about the designs. And what we know of ancient tattooing is just dependent on what happened to get recorded. In some cases, there was a lot recorded, like the Marquesas. In other cases, like Tahiti, there was very, very little. In Hawaii, there was a good bit, but not a tremendous amount. Quite a few drawings, but we didn't know what any of them meant. So I was presenting all of the historic material on Hawaii, and then I went to talk about the revival and started that with an image of the cover of Ed Hardy's Tattoo Time, the issue on new tribalism, which has a gorgeous photo on the cover of a hybrid piece that's heavily Samoan inspired, with a Japanese snake in color curving up over it. So I started the modern section with this image and showed quite a few other pieces, mostly pieces that I'd photographed from published sources like Tattoo Time. Some photos of people that I had met. This is before I was tattooing. During the Q&A, someone asked, where did the name New Tribal come from? And I said, I don't know. And he asked, well, is that an anthropological term or, from academia? And I said, no, in fact, it's somewhat inappropriate. It's not a term. We wouldn't use the word tribal for a number of reasons. And I couldn't see that someone in the back of the room had their hand up. He came forward and he said, when I tattooed Leo's back, so I immediately knew that this was Ed Hardy. And he was referring to Leo Zulueta. And I said, oh, Mr. Hardy, here, please take the podium. If you wouldn't mind taking some questions, that would be wonderful, since you were a key person in this revival.
He spent some time in Hawaii too, didn't he, back then?
Yeah, he lived here for quite a while, a long time, but he always worked in San Francisco. He never actively tattooed here, so I certainly couldn't apprentice under him. But he encouraged me to start tattooing in preparation for a trip to Rapa Nui. And he would initially kind of look over my work and critique it. So he was a major influence on me, and he's just a wonderful individual.
Yeah,
So
very good
I
at
enjoyed coming to know him.
yeah. Great to keep the whole momentum of tattooing, the growth of tattooing and education about it going in the beginning days, I think.
Yeah,
Um,
that's right.
And so I think you told me at one point that he had encouraged you to take the real thing to Rapa Nui rather than take them designs, was how you got.
Yeah. While I was a graduate student at UH, every Friday, the oceanography department had a great party, a TGIF. So everybody who's anybody would go down to oceanography department and hang out and maybe have a few beers. And down in Waikiki, they light off fireworks every Friday night. So we go up to the roof of the oceanography building and watch the fireworks. In doing this, I met the chief scientist for these oceanography research expeditions that were measuring seafloor spreading off the coast of Rapa Nui. The world's fastest moving tectonic plate is there. And this particular group had been there 8 times, or this was their 8th time, but they knew nothing of the culture. They call these cruises, even though it's an expedition. But the cruise ended on Rapa Nui, so they'd all spent time there, but didn't know much about the history or the moai, the big statues. When were they built? Why were they built? All of that. So I also had run across a drawing of a tattooed individual that was done in 1799. And it was from an archive in Leipzig, Germany, that showed the moving of a statue tattooed on a gentleman's arm. So, and there was hundreds of years of debate as to how these statues were moved. And, there's about 1,200 of them around the island. So I thought, well, here's a tattoo illustration. We know at least how this one was moved. Let's see if they all might have been moved this way. So I mentioned this to the chief scientist on this expedition, and he said, I have the equipment on board that ship. We can test out your theory. Cool. So I had to interview for the position. They were looking for 5 scientific party who were a volunteer, and usually they're PhD students in oceanography, which I was not. My interview was 5 questions. The first was, does your committee or your committee chair know that you're going, and do you have their permission? I responded, no, but I don't need it because they trust me. And this is a great opportunity. I don't have money to do field work. So, hey, free travel to Tahiti and Rapa Nui, they'll back me. No problem. Then they asked, do you get seasick? I had to say, I don't know. And then, do you speak Spanish or French? No, neither one, because they were sailing from Tahiti, which is French Polynesia, to Rapa Nui, which is governed by Chile. And then the 4th question was, do you play poker? I said, well, not really, but I'll learn. And then the 5th question is, what's your favorite Beatles song? Responded, any of them, all of them. So I got the position. I think that they were looking for people that they knew could get along for 40 days and 40 nights. I like the weird biblical association because it could be a challenge for some individuals to be out at sea for that long. We never saw land. There's very little in the way of bird life when you're out in the middle of the ocean, and the ocean there is incredibly deep. You don't see or hear fish, even whales on the sonar thing are rare. So they were looking for people that could get along in those circumstances. And then also, I had something to offer in that I knew something about the culture and about the culture history, about the moai and the legends and such. And it was a great opportunity because they flew me to Tahiti, and then we sailed from Tahiti on a ship called Melville. And Melville had written Moby Dick, of course, but also Taipi and Omu, where he had passages about Marquesan tattoo. So I thought, okay, the ship's named the Melville. It's for 40 days and 40 nights. This is just odd enough for me. This must be my calling. It was great. I changed my ticket on Rapa Nui to stay 5 more times. So I spent about ballpark 4 months there on the island, and then did the same on Tahiti on my way back home to spend more time in Tahiti and to seek out and get to know the tattooists that were working on Tahiti.
Tattooing there at all or no?
No, there were people that were hand poking themselves that were doing, the same thing that kids do on their hands and such here. And one young man that had tattooed himself with USA, I asked him, USA, Honto USA, because USA looks like a Polynesian word. Polynesian dialects usually only include 12 letters and certain letter sequences. And USA, USA, is very much like a Polynesian word. So people would ask him, USA, quanto USA? What's USA? And he said, loco mucho pisco. He was drunk. He was crazy on too much pisco. So while I was on Rapa Nui, I passed out surgical markers to a lot of people, especially people that were ashamed of their tattoos, hand poke tattoos, like Molokini that wore USA on his arm. And I said, draw designs that are Rapa Nui and let them draw on themselves for a few days and wear it for a bit. And I say, le gusta? Le gusta? Do you like this one? Do you like that one? And as soon as they said, yes, I like this, I would tattoo right over it. So I tattooed about 45 Rapa Nui people free. And I wound up during the making of that film, Rapa Nui, with Kevin Reynolds and Kevin Costner. I tattooed the film crew to pay for my being there, to pay my accommodations and food and supplies for the Rapa Nui so that I could tattoo them free. I was injured while I was on the island during that time. And by then I had a lot of Rapa Nui friends. So people were bringing me tattooed people and their tattooed friends to show me their tattoos. And I met a 7-year-old who was tattooed and another 9-year-old and an 11-year-old. So they don't have the issues that we have with tattooing.
Taken Rapa Nui imagery with you, correct?
Yeah, I had taken pages and pages of photocopies of old books because the Rapa Nui were not allowed access to their library, and photocopies of all of the early tattoo illustrations. But most of the people that I worked on and tattooed were drawing their inspiration from rock art and from wood carving. If I could reach up, I would grab a Rapa Nui sculpture and show you the design that it has on its head. A lot of these wooden carvings called moe kapa kapa do have designs on the top of the head, which are beautiful for tattoos because traditionally the tattoos were full body pieces. And people today really don't want that. And it just wasn't feasible for me to be doing that. But there's a lot of designs from their rock art and their petroglyphs and their carvings that made beautiful tattoos. Now, I should back up a little bit because you asked me how did I start tattooing, and I didn't quite finish that story. So when I was giving that presentation at the university, I came to know Hardy afterwards. We talked quite a little bit. He asked about publishing my master's thesis, which was too academic. He did publish my work in Tattoo Time in the Art from the Heart series. There's an article on Marquesan tattoo. But we kept in touch, and periodically when he was on the island, we'd have lunch or get together. When I found out that I'd be going on this expedition, I had been photocopying all of the material that I could get and buying secondhand books to take to the island. One day at lunch, I showed him a lot of these drawings of old Rapa Nui tattoos and told him about the trip. And he said, wouldn't it be good to give him the real thing instead of a photocopy? And until that point, I never thought about doing tattoos myself.
Really not? Like, not one time it gave you any idea of interest in it. You were just like, I'm going to provide the people that are doing it with the information, but I don't want to do it.
Yeah, it never even crossed my mind that I would do it or that I would have a tattoo. Although Hardy at one point did do my first tattoo, my first couple of tattoos. My first was a Marquesan ankle band that marked the completion of my master's thesis. And he did it in the San Francisco studio because he's never tattooed in Hawaii. And that's one reason that he couldn't or wouldn't apprentice me, is he just didn't practice in Hawaii. But he did give me a lot of tips and suggest what equipment I should buy. He had me buy the machine kit by National, had me solder that kit together and then unsolder it and take it apart and solder it together again and replace the capacitor so that I really understood the inner workings of a machine before I started. I spent hours doing this and it was pretty tedious. I still don't enjoy that kind of work. I learned to solder needles, which nobody today or very few people today do. We didn't have the supply companies back then. This is 91, 92. that we have today. Today there's needles coming out of China that cost next to nothing, and there's multiple companies selling and manufacturing. But back then it was about 5 different suppliers. Spalding Rogers was one of the biggest or the one that had the most exposure.
Yeah. Well, I remember being surprised when I was in Tahiti and I was visiting with Puro too, and he was showing me the hand tapping tools, which with the needles, I thought for sure he'd have to solder them because they were huge. Some of them are 45 to 60 needles. And he says no, and he brings out a bunch of pre-made stuff that came from New Zealand, you know? So that surprised me, but then not really, because New Zealand, obviously, that's main part of their tattooing culture. But even those guys don't have to solder needles anymore.
No, and actually that's really very new that you can buy those big, broad, flat needle clusters and that the islanders are using them. Isaiah Toitu'u, the Tongan tattooist, actually he's Tongan and Hawaiian, and his full title is Suluape Isaiah Toitu'u. So he does have those Samoan titles and is a titled tattoo master today. But Isaiah was the first one to really start working with the stainless steel needles hafted to traditional tools. And it was because some of the Samoans that he was in contact with and was friends with, he had apprenticed under Sulumape Patelo Aliva'a and were working tattoo conventions and such, where tattooing was regulated by the health department and you could not use bone tools. And bone tools, too, are really tricky to adequately sterilize. They can be put in an ultrasonic, and there are liquid cleansers like peracetic acid that are somewhat effective, but using bleach and wavicide or germicide can damage and make the bone brittle. So the only really safe way with bone tools is to carve a set for every one of your clients. And those things take a long time to make. So Isaiah came up with using the stainless steel tips and clusters, needle clusters, hafted to traditional tools, and worked with the Samoans, got them using them, at least when they were away from home and at conventions. It took a few years for him to really perfect it and get it down to where it was effective. He worked with them for a number of years, and then just probably 5 to 8 years ago, we started seeing supply companies manufacturing these big clusters. And now the Samoans are ordering and getting them that way also. So it's possible to get a traditional tattoo and to make sure it's hygienic and clean.
Right, and you were
Since,
also instrumental in some of that, I think, the
well, some
hygiene
of that,
aspect.
there's one Samoan tattooist who's largely based in Aotearoa, New Zealand, that has been very instrumental, and that's one of his primary focuses, and that's Lawrence Shing, who's on Facebook. He does outstanding work. Everything is clean and sterilized. Even his bowl, the handles that he's using on the tools. Lawrence has really made that a primary goal. So has Isaiah, in helping them work clean.
Yeah, when you went to Tahiti, I imagine that all those guys hand poking and using razor machines were not exactly clean. I think you mentioned that
No,
you helped those guys.
um, well, there wasn't the understanding. In Tahiti, it's really never been a push for public education on HIV transmission. I was spending a lot of time there in the early 90s, 92 through 97. I cumulatively spent 37 months over 16 trips to Tahiti. And at one point, there was one free clinic, HIV clinic, that was doing free testing, and there was a bit of publicity, but there just wasn't the knowledge or understanding of bloodborne diseases and transmission. So it was just a concept so foreign to most young Tahitians or islanders that they didn't see the importance or the need. I wasn't going to go in and say, oh, you can't do that. You can't work that way. So I realized fairly quickly that the best way to approach it is just to offer to tattoo them. And almost all of the tattooists said, I want to see your machine. I want to see your equipment. Can I try it? Will you tattoo me? So I said, sure. I never tattooed commercially there. In fact, when I was on Rapa Nui, if we back up a couple of years, When the Rapa Nui asked how much, I said, well, nothing. Bring me a fish or feed me or loan me your motorcycle for a day or let me borrow your horse. And some people brought me carvings and things, but I wasn't going to charge the local people,
So,
the
but what
trade
is your
system.
methodology for that? Is that simply, I think you've said at times you felt like you should give back.
Yeah, uh-huh. Well, with tattooing the people free on Rapa Nui, which was my first time really down in the Pacific. I lived in Hawaii, of course, but it's not the same. Here, islanders are in a percentage of, less than 30%, whereas there in Tahiti, it was like 93% on some of the islands, on Huahine and Rapa Nui, it's the same way. Rapa Nui at that point had a population of about 1,500 Rapa Nui people and about 500 Chileans. Some people that I would talk to were surprised that there was anybody there. They thought it was just a isolated island with those big statues, which many people think are just heads, but no, they're bodies. They have full bodies. So my motivations were really to provide them access to the same materials that I've had access to. I've been lucky enough to get into some of the best Pacific libraries in the world and Pacific museums, and to be able to photograph and photocopy, in some cases, those materials. It's a shame that they're locked away in these collections and not accessible to the island people. That's who they belong to. I thought from the very beginning that it's kind of my duty to provide access to what I've been given access to. So those were my first thoughts, bring them down this material. The people that I was corresponding with on Rapa Nui, I was given their names by a German ethnographer who had spent 4 years there and on the island of Mangareva, and he's blind. His name was Horst Kane. He came through Hawaii, and all of these researchers would give a brown bag seminar or something at the university, which he did, and then he asked if anybody would volunteer as their driver. So, of course, sure, me. I drove an old VW window van, um, which was also home for a good part of my college career. Housing is so expensive here. So I drove them around and was kind of their driver and their guide while they were here. And he's the one that had given me the names and addresses of the people on Rapa Nui that did have a real interest in tattoo, and told me that no one there was actively tattooing. So providing these people with the materials that we have here seemed critical and to be a moral imperative. Then with tattooing them, when I got there, the tattoos that I did see were all self-done, hand-poked stuff. There was very, very little Rapa Nui imagery. It was all Western introduced stuff. So part of my goal was to make them realize that their designs are beautiful and that it's worth reviving their art. Not necessarily their tattoo art, because the old illustrations show full body tattoos, which just aren't realistic in many cases. But the tattoos from their wood carvings and from their rock art and petroglyphs and cave paintings make beautiful designs.
Were they familiar with what you brought them design-wise?
Yes, most of the designs they were very familiar with, because there are a lot of caves on the island. Caves where there are beautiful cave paintings and rock art, petroglyphs that are carved into the rocks. The carvers on the island were very proud to say that, look, this carving is a copy from the book of Thor Heyerdahl, because Heyerdahl had published a lot of the Rapa Nui carvings. Now, the other thing that's kind of funny about the Heyerdahl expedition, and I had had the opportunity to meet Thor a few times, as had my good friend Bridget Malloy. Her father worked with him on Rapa Nui and wound up staying a number of years and going back and moving the family there. So Bridget grew up there. What people were telling them that worked with Heyerdahl is that Heyerdahl would very excitedly ask, have you seen carvings like this or like this or like this? Or do you see rock carvings like this? So to make him happy, the people would go back home and carve them quickly and then go bury them in the dirt so he could find them. So Some of the art that's in his book are these pieces, like there's a stone cat's head. And of course, cats were introduced. So some of them are not ancient pieces by any means. But the people today, 20, 30 years ago, when I was first there, often do turn to these resources like that for their design inspiration. And similarly, people in the Marquesas and Tahiti are turning to the early drawings by the observers there, and going to those early records for their inspiration on designs. Now, in some cases, in the case of the Maori people of New Zealand and the Marquesas, wood carving was kept alive. And there's some incredibly talented, beautiful wood carving that's done in both places. So knowledge of the designs was kept alive via wood carving and in Marquesan culture and Maori culture. But details on the tattoos themselves, the application, the placement, the meaning of many of the symbols in the Marquesas was lost.
Well, I'm talking a little more about designs at this point. There's certain feeling that these designs should be kept to just the people that are from the places that they come from. And then there's also this whole worldwide explosion where these designs are now available to anybody, which was in part your book, Tattoo Traditions of Hawaii, gave those to people. You published that so that people would be aware of them. But now, of course, it's worldwide and it's being somewhat diluted or changed or modified to certain ways. Like, how do the local people feel about that? The indigenous cultures of the Polynesian islands.
Well, let's back up a little bit because I don't think my book I could take credit for that at all. The whole tribal explosion in tattoos started in the mid 80s. The book Modern Primitives and Leo Zulueta's work and that kind of neo Borneo Micronesian style Celtic design. Tattooists at that time, maybe early to mid 1980s, got turned on to Celtic knotwork and Pacific Northwest coast art like Haida and Kwakiutl and other groups from that area. So there was an explosion of Black graphic tattoos, tribal
I think I
tattoos.
meant that, with your book, it was anybody that was interested in the Polynesian tattoo suddenly had like reference to hand. It was like a Bible. I mean, we all were like, wow, you know.
That's true. Now, that book, though, was limited to Hawaiian design, which is very traditional Hawaiian design, is very simplistic, very repetitious, very geometric. Also, many of those appear in many, many cultures. So, yeah. And making that available for me was an effort to put the art back in the hands of the Hawaiian people, because that material's illustrations are so hard to find. Several of those originals by Jacques Arago, the Frenchman that we discussed, had never been published before. And they're here at the Honolulu Museum of Art, but they've only been exhibited once. I guess curated a show there in I think 2009. So they're drawings that we wouldn't otherwise have access to and can tell us a lot about the cultural practices of the early Hawaiian people, about many Hawaiians' ancestors. This is their culture. But again, it's locked away in museums and we just don't have access. So my goal was really making it available to them. And Hawaiian designs are so simplistic and bold that I think that most artists and many artists from other cultures during early times hit upon the same designs. For example, we could take a spiral and show exactly that same spiral that was used in Maori art and in Celtic art. Yeah, so in this book of these designs are what I would call pan-Pacific. That is, they're used throughout the whole Pacific. And some of them are universal. They're used by many, many cultures. The spiral, we see lots of that same spiral that Maori and Celtic people use in petroglyphs from the Southwest. And the meaning might vary. The meaning in the Southwest, it's usually said that the spiral designates your path in life, whereas in the Marquesas, it's said to represent a coiled shellfish. The Maori version, the koru, is the new growth on a tree fern. So the same symbol might have different meanings throughout the Pacific as well, but cross culturally. But the island people, back to your question, in many cases, they don't mind. The tattooists in Tahiti, and there were a huge number. At one point, I was able to compile a list of the names of 300 tattooists between the main island of Tahiti itself and the sister island, Moorea. So there were a huge number of people that were practicing it. They weren't what we would call professionals by any means. You know, they do it in their garage part time and it's homemade equipment. But that's how most of them started there. Even the ones that today are called the superstars of tattooing and going to conventions and published, they all started off like that. Most early Western artists, American artists, and European artists started off like that.
Yeah, if they told the truth.
Yeah, right. Uh-huh. They started as scratchers. And I've been accused also of helping scratchers. And yeah, this is their indigenous art. If
Well,
I'm
it's
going to help them do
embedded
it
in the
cleaner,
culture. Yeah. Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
it's really to help them to learn to do it properly and hygienically with their original designs was absolutely really not something you should have been blamed for, I don't think.
No, right. Although there are tattooists that have criticized me for that. And yeah, it's true. I do help scratchers. But if I can turn them professional and get them working clean and turn them on to their indigenous designs, boy, I'll do it. That's what's going to keep the art alive. Yeah. So the Marquesas, they reached the point where they were absolutely fed up with any and everybody using their designs. In Tahiti, there was very, very little decorative designs, things like house posts and, you know, carved canoes and such like that. They just weren't as prolific as they were in the Marquesas. The Marquesas had phenomenal carving, beautiful wood carving, carved bowls and all sorts of things, and beautiful tattoos that were well documented. Tahiti hotels, businesses, and such started using Marquesan design all over the place. Almost everything you would see as far as decorative arts in the Marquesa or in Tahiti was Marquesan in origin in the early 90s, late 80s. Then it reached the point where commercial companies, an American jeans company, and I don't know, it must have been either Levi or Wrangler or Lee. I'm not sure. I wasn't told. But the Marquesans had gotten word that they planned to do a line of blue jeans with Marquesan patterns on it. And that was just too much. So, a dear friend of mine who was a member of parliament at the time introduced a bill to restrict the use of Marquesan designs and only allow Marquesans in French Polynesia to use them. Or if anybody else does, you go through the Arts Council for approval before this can be used so that we don't have things like jeans with Marquesan symbols on them.
That's totally
The
good.
bill went, yeah, the bill was introduced 2 years. It did not pass. So then they took it to the UN to file for a cultural copyright and cultural heritage, which is appropriate. So there they really don't appreciate it. Although the general consensus is that if you change it, modify it, make it your own, don't copy it verbatim from the old sources. It's somewhat acceptable. You can draw your own things, maybe have a Marquesan influence, but it's not a Marquesan design. Don't call it one. Don't make up a story about what it means if it's something you created. And a good, funny example of that is I had a young client who was early 20s, and I'm tattooing a shoulder piece on him. He's part Hawaiian. He had a few zits on his arm, so I had to leave these little holes or pukas where he had the zits. And because I wasn't going to tattoo over them, these were sizable pimples. And I told him, come back in 6 months or so. Chances are, because you've got big, heavy black hair, it's going to need a touch up anyway. So just come back and we'll fill those in. So he did come back and he said, I don't want them filled. I like them. And what does that design mean? It means Adam had a zit. Oh, what's funny is that the work of some of my Marquesan friends, and of course we follow each other on Instagram and Facebook, I started seeing that same thing, the little round holes in their tattoos. So I've been influenced by them and they're influenced by me.
Right.
But if you're wanting to wear a traditional design, my recommendation would be go to someone of that culture
Right.
or someone that knows that culture well, that's lived there, that spent time with the people. Um, and pay your dues. Like if somebody asks me for a Marquesan tattoo, I'll tell them, first of all, I won't do something that's truly Marquesan. I'll do something Marquesan inspired. Will it be a Marquesan tattoo? No, it'll be a Tricia Allen tattoo inspired by Marquesan tattoo. But even before I do that, I'm going to give you some homework. Can you find the Marquesas on a map? Can you name the primary islands? Do you know anything about the history? When did the French arrive? When was their first contact? Let me give you some reading about the Marquesas if you really want to wear something that's heavily inspired by Marquesan art.
Right. And there are definitely parts of those cultures that will not allow their designs to be put onto people that are not from there at all, like the Maori, for example. And I hear
Yeah.
Samoan also.
Well, Samoa's a little different, but Maori tattoos were genealogical. They were ancestral. You can recognize the iwi or the bloodline, the clan of the people by the tattoo. For example, the moko kauwhai, the woman's chin tattoo. It's fairly obvious right off what lineage or what group a woman comes from when she's wearing that tattoo because they don't vary a lot. You know, a tuhoi tattoo will have almost the same identical, near identical characteristics. So when a tattoo is definitely ancestral, yeah, we don't touch it.
But people don't know, so they copy it, and then it's kind of wrong.
Yeah, there's been so much interest in it, though, that a number of the Maori practitioners created with a word, kirituhi, which literally just translates as skin art. So they're okay doing kirituhi or skin art on people. And they'll work with the client to try and find something that does have significance or personal meaning. But in the same way that a Maori tattoo does, no. So that's acceptable. Whereas copying something verbatim is not. Yeah, just don't copy something because you saw it in a book and you think it's cool. Find out what it really means, who really would have worn it, ask the people. Now, some tattooists don't have a problem at all doing souvenir type pieces. Um, in Tahiti by about 1995 were literally dozens of tattooists that were doing small pieces that were largely Marquesan inspired, things like manta rays, sharks, dolphins, flowers with Marquesan motifs within the flowers. So these are contemporary interpretations or reinterpretations of Marquesan design, and they were putting it on tourists all of the time. Some more traditional pieces, like shoulder pieces and armbands. A lot of their clientele were French military because at this point, mid 90s, there was a large French presence in on Tahiti, the military. So those were their primary clients. So the Tahitians at that point didn't have a problem with it. But that was not a traditional design per se. You know, they were loosely inspired by Marquesan symbols. And I think that's fine. The only problem that I have is that in many cases, they're making up stories and interpretations to go along with it. Like, for example, a tattooist might ask, "Oh, do you have children?" And the client might say, "Yes, a boy and a girl." So the tattooist says, "Okay, here's a shark for your boy and a dolphin for your girl." Now, traditionally, did they carry that meaning? No, of course not.
But they'll take the meaning whichever way the client wants it just to get the money for tourist purposes.
Right, yeah. And that's okay as long as we recognize that. Adam had a zit is okay as long as we call it Adam had a zit. It's misrepresenting things that I think lead to problems. It leads to a loss of a knowledge of the traditional art designs. So
I had heard recently that the Samoan tattoo family were trying to bring all the tattooers together in an understanding that only Samoan tattooers and people that they had specifically taught or given permission could use their motifs and designs in order to stop this kind of perversion of the design meanings and spreading of, diluted meanings, let's say. Is there truth to that, or what is the feeling that?
Yeah, there is some truth to that, but it's so specific to the individual. Um, the younger Sulawape now that's practicing, Patelo Aliva'a's son, is very much leaning that direction. And there are certain designs that are and always have been specific to certain families. There's a particular fish, very linear geometric fish, that the Sulawape family uses. There's other designs that, if you know these symbols and know the families, you can look at a tattoo and say, that's a Sulawape that did this. Um, there's also different methods of aligning the malu, the woman's tattoo on the leg. So even as early, well, my exposure to it was about 35, 38 years ago. If you knew how a particular artist lays it out, you could usually identify the artist by looking at the piece. We all have our own styles. And in Samoa, it's kind of seen like, I know that the Suluapes feel that that's their fish and that they do kind of have a copyright on it. Now, is that fish a super old symbol? Do we find that 200 years ago? No, but that's okay. In Samoan recent tattoo history, what happened with the coming of the Peace Corps is a lot of these individuals wanted Samoan souvenir tattoos to take home to show that they had spent time in Samoa, but of course they didn't want to get the full the knees to waist tattoo or the malu, the thigh tattoo. So there was an increased demand for wristbands, ankle bands, armbands, and armbands had been practiced before and they were called taonima. So a tattooing of the hands was also done, lima hands in Samoan culture. Mostly women, but men had it as well. So here with the coming of the Peace Corps, a lot of the tattoo families and tattoo artists created new symbols that could easily be done with the owl, the traditional tool. To some degree, the tools dictate the patterns. So we do see quite a few design motifs that were coming up and getting popular at this time. And yeah, today there is kind of a return to the more traditional values, but it's gone through these patterns of these waves. Patelo Aliva'a, the tattoo master, um, has often felt that you have to share it. That if we don't share it, and Paulo, his brother, felt this way too. There was an excellent article and interview by Sean Mallon, who's one of the curators at Te Papa, the National Museum of New Zealand, on the globalization of Samoan tattoo. And he addresses a number of these issues. Um, that the titles for the Sulawape family, they felt that there weren't enough family members and enough Samoans wanting to practice and apprentice in the art, that if outsiders wanted to, that might be the only way to keep it alive. So in order to ensure that tattooing continues, and in order to ensure that it's done properly, they did give the title to a number of professional tattoo artists outside Oceania, outside the Pacific, and work with them for short durations during the time of 4 days or what of a convention, showing them some of the designs and basically giving them permission to use those and giving them the title. Now, that is the Suluwape title. Suluwape is a name. It's a family name. Sua is a whole nother ballgame. The Sua Suluwape are those that have mastered use of the traditional tools and have done their first set of clients. And Samoans would never tattoo just one individual. You would have your tattoo brothers and sisters. An ideal number seems to have been 5. They would do as many as 7 or 8 at a time that go through this process together. That's relatively true today, too. although I have heard of people getting it individually in recent years. So yeah, the younger generation now is kind of leaning back towards those traditional values that no, it should be kept to Samoans. And for many Samoans, the community members, they believe that its ownership is with them. It's the Samoan community that owns these things, that it's a cultural copyright. And for some of the tofunga or tattooists, they think otherwise. They think that they're the artists, that they own the copyright, that they own the designs, and that they own and have the right to give away those designs and to give away permission to use them. So that's been somewhat controversial.
Yeah. But it's kind of, I think, partly related to cultural sensitivity, which I was curious that you mentioned that you actually discovered in the books and notes of Captain Cook and the botanist drawings and letters back in the day in the British Library.
Yeah. The issue was the use of a particular term. If we're talking about the big stone outdoor temples, here in Hawaii, they're called heiau. In Tahiti, they're called marae. And the Marquesas, it's mai. On Rapa Nui, it's ahu. Uh, so the discussion between Cook and Joseph Banks was, do they change the name and the word as they go from one culture to the next? Or since they started with a Tahitian marae, do they use that term across the board for simplicity and to avoid confusion? And I was amazed that they were discussing this, 200 and some odd years ago.
Right.
Um,
It's kind of cool, though, in a way that they were thinking about that back then, because a lot of the colonialists weren't. They were just thinking about flattening everything and making it the same, you know? So I thought that
right.
was a
Yeah.
curious part of it all. So, well, that's
Yeah.
fascinating. The stories of all of this we could go on for hours and hours with, I think, you know? But in the meantime, I mean, I really got to give you a massive amount of credit for being what I would consider a bridge for the Polynesian peoples to get their culture back and their history back to a large point as far as the designs buried in the museums under the dust of centuries goes, you know? I think it's amazing.
Well, thank you. And I'm really glad today that there's a few people that are picking up the pieces and continuing in
Mhm.
that. Recently, Will Cattersell, who's a European practitioner and artist, spent some time, a good 6 weeks or so, in the Solomon Islands, working with the Polynesian community there from Redel and Bologna. In some of these places today, it's still very remote. They don't have easy access to computers and or have the money to be purchasing equipment and have the resources. So there's still a need for that.
Well, it's nice that you
Oh,
laid the seeds for it, you know, did the groundwork for other people to be able to continue this work and to, you know, bring these traditions back and help people support them in the revival of it, you know. I think it's a good thing for all of us in tattooing, you know. So,
well, thanks. I appreciate it. And I really appreciate what you're doing with these podcasts. It's been fun.
okay, well, thank you. So a little bit about your books. I know that did you say they're out of print now, but they can still be found, I'm sure.
Yeah, they're out of print. Tattoo Traditions of Hawaii, in my mind, is the more important of the two because it's got the real history, the real 20 years worth of research in that book, and a pretty complete compilation of early original drawings. And then the statements of 30 or so Hawaiian practitioners. I don't do interviews, I let them just say whatever they want about their tattoos. That book's been out of print for a while, but you can find copies on Amazon used and on eBay. In fact, that's how I've been buying them when I see copies at good prices. And there is a good chance that I may self publish that or get that back into print. And then the second book went through 7 printings. So there were a lot of them out there in the neighborhood of 30,000 or so,
And that's the
figuring that each book.
Polynesian tattoo today, the
Right.
title.
Yeah. And that one is really just a pretty picture book. There were a lot of artists and people that wanted to be in the book, the first book, but they didn't want to write or say anything.
Mhm.
But they just wanted to see their work out there.
Right.
So that was the goal in the second book, is to provide a pretty representative sampling of what was happening then, 2009, in the way of Polynesian art and Polynesian inspired art. And I probably will be doing basically a new version or edition of that, which will be the Polynesian tattoo revisited.
It's been a
So
few
there's a
years, right?
strong
It's been a lot come and go in that time.
there's a strong possibility of that because tattooing's come a long way since 2009, and there's a lot of people that have gotten into the game and are doing spectacular work.
Well, thank you so much for being on and talking to me. I really appreciate everything you've done for tattooing and all the things that you will do in the future. So thank you very much.